Please, let's start now.
Yeah. Good evening, all. Welcome to session 4 of the Exalt podcast series. Exalt Exchanges on Law, Technology, and Society is a series focused on the societal and legal implications of technology. Today, we have with us Professor Subbarao Kamrampati. Dr. Rao has been a faculty in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Arizona State University since 1991. His research interests include planning and decision making for human in the loop AI systems, automated planning, and social media analysis and information integration. His work has been widely covered in media, and he has also delivered lectures and keynotes around the world. Professor Rao was the president of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence and has received numerous grants and honors in a long and distinguished career. Welcome, Dr. Rao. Thank you for your time and making it rather early in the morning for you. We are glad to have you with us today. We generally have speakers from social sciences who worked in technology and policy aspects of it, but we are really delighted to have somebody from the computer science background to get an insider view of a technology like the artificial intelligence. So thank you for making it today. We will begin with the discussion, before which I would just want to remind our audience to keep their mics on mute. Also, if you have questions, you can post it in the chat window and we'll take them up during the conversation if they seem relevant to the discussion then. I hand it over to Prabhat now.
Thank you, Mandira. Um, First of all, I would like to thank Professor Rao for showing up at 6 a.m. in the morning. He graciously agreed for our invitation way back in February, and um, he came through. And also, I would like to thank everyone in the audience who came here. We know that times are very difficult, and so thank you so much. Uh, Please keep your mics on mute and post the questions in the chat box. Also, if you're comfortable and your bandwidth allows, you can switch on your video. Okay, so firstly, I would like to ask Professor Rao about the resurgence of AI in popular media, in movies, and as a topic of discussion in conferences and podcasts like these, not just in computer science and allied disciplines, but policy disciplines related to policy and social science disciplines as well. So, if he could throw some light on what led to this AI becoming a buzzword few years back, and the next big thing in technology and so on. And if he could, the more the anecdotes the better in it, because he has a long journey, and we would love to hear his views on this. Professor Lau.
Hi, again, thanks for having me. And I know things are rather crazy out there in Delhi. Hope you guys all pull through well. So regarding the reason why everybody is talking about AI. So first of all, I was always talking about AI myself, as at least since 1983, and then the area called artificial intelligence existed at least since 1956, when there was this meeting in Dartmouth, where a bunch of people basically got together and sort of tried to talk about whether computers can be intelligent. Actually, the idea of thinking that maybe mechanical intelligence is possible predates even that. Alan Turing is considered the father of computing as a discipline. And I joke around with my students that the first thing that he was thinking of as soon as he had figured out that computation is universal, that is not how big an Excel spreadsheet computers can do, but whether machines can think. So that was basically something that we always wondered, because humans consider intelligence as something that is particularly their prerogative. That's our niche in the evolution. We seem to be way better than anybody else. That's why most of the other species almost are extinct thanks to us. But we consider intelligence as like the distinctive feature, and it was interesting for us to figure out whether there is a way of getting machines to show intelligent behavior. By 1956, I guess there was this meeting that was held, and then they gave it a name, AI. And there's been a bunch of interest in trying to get, in fact, at that particular meeting, the idea was that within 10 years, machines will be able to defeat people in chess. This was in 1956. So by 1966, it should have been done. And of course, in 1966, nothing happened. And people basically thought, oh, well, people made a huge claim. Nothing really is happening in AI. But by 1997, we did have computers that actually defeated Kasparov. And so chess is no longer considered like only humans are able to do chess. Machines are way better than us now. And so we don't play machines anymore. So this was going on for a while. And the reason why people talk a lot more about AI is quite interesting. So I give this anecdote, this allegory, that if you think about the way intelligent behavior is shown in human babies, right? I mean, the babies are born, they come into this world, they start essentially recognizing faces, they start holding things, manipulating things, putting it into their head, mouths, etc., up front. And then they will start having some emotional intelligence, some social intelligence, how to get along with kids and so on. And then finally start having like cognitive intelligence, the kinds of things that you do to take all the various entrance exams and get into colleges and all that stuff, which we tend to think is intelligence, right? Um, Interestingly, the early AI systems already were doing cognitive intelligence tasks way better. Basically by 97, as we know, chess was already out of the human purview. Machines were winning chess matches. Um, and so the more interesting thing is that the machines, however, were not good at doing the things that babies do upfront. So they were doing it in the almost opposite direction. We could do cognitive intelligence tasks much before, I mean, we could make machines do cognitive intelligence tasks much before we could make them do perceptual intelligence tasks, basically looking at faces, recognizing them, looking at objects, recognizing them, looking at objects, holding them. This stuff which we babies have, they come in, with that ability machines didn't have. And what changed the most recently really is around 2012, 2013 timeframe, we sort of figured out that in fact perception is actually doable mostly by basically learning from examples. And it was always, learning was always possible. It's just that we didn't have that many examples. So to be able to do perception the way AI does right now, you essentially need humongous number of pictures and their labels. This is a cat, this is a dog, this is something else, and millions and millions and millions of these pictures. And people don't realize now when we have WhatsApp and every 3 seconds people are sending us 10,000 pictures, they don't remember a time when there used to be very few pictures. And so back then, essentially computer vision as a discipline would get by with very few examples, very few digitized pictures and so on. And all of a sudden, because of extension, because of developments that happened outside of AI really, because cell phone technology, internet technology, all this stuff, we wound up having this ability to gather tons and tons and tons of multimedia data, including pictures, including voice, including text. And that allowed for there to be humongous amount of raw data. And it turned out that perceptual tasks, actually, you can't program the computer to do them. This is another very important thing that I think pretty much all of us understand, that we have two kinds of knowledge and capabilities. One kind of knowledge and capability we have is what's called explicit knowledge. So you know how to do something and you can describe it to people how you do something. Okay, that's explicit knowledge tasks. The other is tacit knowledge tasks where you know how to do it, but you have no way you can explain to people how to do it. Okay, recognizing your mother's face, you know how to do it. But if I ask you, can you send me an email as to how I can recognize your mother's face? You can only write it in English or in Hindi or whatever. You have no idea how to do it. I mean, you will write some random things like she has long hair, but everybody else has also long hair. That's not really distinguishing of your mother. It's not clear how to actually come up with, a recipe for recognizing your mother's face. All you can really do is you know how to do it, but you don't know how to tell the computer how to do it. And in those cases, what you will wind up having to do is depend on saying, okay, here are all the pictures of my mother, here are all the pictures of other people. And this one is my mother, this one is not. And then let the machine sort of figure out what are the things that are different between these types of examples. This is basically what learning is, by learning from examples. And that essentially is what people wound up doing starting 2012 for these perceptual tasks. And that has sort of, once they became possible, the perceptual, the voice recognition, the image recognition wound up getting into your cell phones, and everybody thinks about it now. And so basically people started thinking a lot more about AI technology in the way they can use it. It already existed in the cognitive intelligence, like there used to be expert systems, there used to be these chess machines and all these things. But the fact that in 97 Kasparov got defeated, that was like a big deal for a couple of days, but your life, day-to-day life didn't change much. Whereas now with the cell phone technology and with the image recognition, voice recognition, believe it or not, I actually can talk to WhatsApp in Telugu and it writes it in Telugu. And in fact, apparently my accent in Telugu is better than my accent in English. So it actually writes it much better in Telugu. This is something that I didn't even think was possible in my lifetime. It's already possible now. And so people have a lot more reason to think directly about AI. And that is a really long-winded answer to what happened and why people got to think about this technology a lot more. And of course, everything in human societies, human cultures is saturation coverage. So we pick one topic and that becomes like the topic of the day, month or year. And so right now AI is the flavor of whatever the decade may be. And so everybody is interested in trying to figure out what are the implications of the technology in their own areas.
Thank you. That covered a lot of ground. And so, if I understand it correctly, Professor Rao,
Mm-hmm.
you're saying that the supporting infrastructure that developed, like big data sets or processing power, that helped in ushering in this age of AI, if I may call it so, and the research in psychology or linguistics or other behavior or the cognitive abilities of human beings was already existent by say the 1950s, or the earlier people who met it at Dartmouth in 1956. They were already aware of these things, these approaches, but
No,
the
no, not that's not what I was saying.
okay.
Basically, after 56, between 56 and 2015, essentially, the first things we did were we were able to program computers with tasks that we not only do, but we know how to do. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it's like, in fact, there is this statement, there's this thing that people say that I, I hear, I understand, I I understand more. I teach, I understand really, really more. And to some extent, that the next level is when I program, I really understand all possible corner cases of how to do something. This this adage is only true for tasks for which you have explicit knowledge. You not only do it, but you know how you do it. Okay. Whereas tacit knowledge tasks, you know how to do it, but you don't know how you do it. Okay. And believe it or not, actually, most of formal education has been about explicit knowledge tasks. That's why you go to a lecture hall or you take slides, you listen to people about how to do a particular kind of technique and so on. Whereas if you want to think about tacit knowledge tasks, swimming is a tacit knowledge task. You know how to swim, but you may know how to swim, but you don't know how to write a paragraph about how swimming is done. In fact, people who try to learn swimming by reading about swimming sink like stones. Okay, that's part of the reason why essentially swimming is the kind of thing that you just almost have to learn by doing or from examples and so on. So there are these two very different kinds of tasks that we are able to do. And human intelligence is a curious combination of both explicit and tacit knowledge. And all I'm saying is that in the beginning, we were doing explicit knowledge tasks already, and now we can also do tacit knowledge tasks. And to actually put this back into your corner, of all the things in the world, law basically, at least as an outsider, what I understand, it prides itself in being an explicit knowledge task. If a judge says, yeah, I feel like you are guilty, don't ask me why I feel this way, you don't like it, right? We basically codified what we think are reasonable ways of doing this, like how to convict people, how to decide whether they have committed a crime or not, etc. All these things, we have decided these essentially and codified it in explicit knowledge. And so, in fact, not surprisingly, AI and law was a flourishing field back in 80s already, 80s and 90s. There's a conference on AI and law that existed at least since like 85, 90 timeframe. It's just that everybody, is paying more attention to AI. So you guys are also paying more attention to AI, but law to me is like one of the most explicit knowledge tasks. It is true that evolutionarily we tend to kind of make tacit assumptions by looking at people and say, oh, this guy looks like a criminal, this person cannot possibly be a criminal. But the civilizational advances that we have done have been all to try to push that aside and say, you don't get to say somebody looks like a criminal. You get to actually have to prove that they are criminal by a certain standardized set of rules. That's the whole point of law. So law is essentially trying to do in explicit knowledge what people tend to try to do in tacit ways. And that is something that could have been done much earlier. And in fact, it has been done much earlier. In fact, when we get to it, we can talk about the fact that the application of basically simple machine learning technologies to scenarios in law, such as recidivism, such as bail granting, etc., has caused humongous grief, because essentially they will tell you what to do and there is no explanation as to why that is the right thing to do. And to me, I'm pretty sure that even though nobody reads the opinions that the Supreme Court judges actually write, you guys do clearly, and you guys think that it's not the decision itself, it is the explanation for the decision. It is what they argued as to why they made that decision. That ultimately is law. Anybody can just say, this is guilty, this is not guilty, we should do it, you shouldn't do it. It is, can you, justify your decision with respect to the precedent, with respect to the rules of the, legal practice, legal profession, and so on. This is something that we should do. Now, on the other hand, what happens when you use learning-based approaches for law, one of the most obvious things would be, I have a huge amount of data from past saying, this particular person was granted bail and then essentially they went back to a life of crime. This other person was granted bail, they didn't go back to a life of crime. And so I have like 10,000 examples or maybe even a million examples. And now I can try to come up with a classifier that says, given a new person, are they likely to go back to life of crime or not? And this is something judges have to decide, right? I mean, every day they have to decide whether to grant bail, whether to whether to kind of grant bail to somebody, are basically, are they worried, are parole to somebody, or do they look like people who might go back to life of crime? And basically, this sort of approach, this sort of a learned and machine learning based approach has been used in various places, especially including in US in Broward County, and that has been shown to have all sorts of problems because essentially learning from examples is, I would argue, is in fact the antithesis of law, right? I mean, you could not just depend on many people who look like you have been criminals, so you look like them, so you must be a criminal. That's not allowed. I mean, I would say that that's something that we should be proud of as a human civilization, that we don't do it that way, because we have evolved to make fight or flight decisions in seconds. This person looks like a criminal, let me run away from them. This person doesn't, let me try to talk to them. But civilization didn't depend on that. Civilization tried to actually come up with explicit knowledge codification. And that, to me, honestly, is one of the most interesting contrasts that AI approaches to law are dealing with right now, because most of them try to do it with machine learning approaches. And this is also connected to this issue of explainability of AI. When people say AI is black boxes, what they really mean is that if you learn from a whole bunch of examples, you don't quite know, especially depending on the way the learned knowledge is represented, you don't quite know why it made the decision it made. If, on the other hand, there are lots and lots of AI systems that can actually explain their decisions, and those tend to be based on the recipes that you have programmed into the machine. And the reason you guys can explain, human lawyers can explain why their defendant should be, let go, etc., is because they're essentially going and, making, supporting their claims with respect to precedent, with respect to legal principles, with respect to various other things. I learned system says, no, look, believe me, trust me, on 10,000 or 10,000 people who look like this guy, 9,000 people are criminals. So let's lock this guy up. Okay. And this is where actually, there's this beautiful, what is that, this principle, Blackstone's principle, I'm pretty sure you guys know, that essentially says, let X guilty go free, not a single innocent be punished. The question is, what is X? Let one guilty go free, not a single innocent be punished. Let 100 guilty go free, not a single innocent be punished. Let 1,000 guilty go free, not a single innocent be punished. It depends. The value that you provide to X tells me about your civilization's interest in making sure that innocent are not punished. And the more of that is there, the more you need to provide explanations as to why you came up with a decision to say that somebody is guilty. And it's not enough to just learn from examples. You need to be able to provide an explanation that makes sense from legal principles, and that kind of combines essentially, because legal profession believes in providing explicit knowledge explanations, and even if, one can argue that that's what jury do, right? They might very well, being human, they might, judges, maybe in India there's no juries, judges might look at a particular person and say, looks like a criminal, let's see what they're going to say. But then in the end, they will write a very nice explanation to come back, to support their decision. It's not just enough to say, I've been right many times before, take my word for it. You don't want it, right? And yeah.
Professor Rao, I was about to ask on the AI hype that is created, or how corporatization has happened, but I think you have addressed the elephant in the room, which is the problem of bias.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to ask, there are two views on this. One view is held by computer scientists, and another is held by people who work on policy and social scientists as well. Uh, The first view is that bias is in the data sets because uh, transphobia, homophobia, racism, misogyny is historically has been a part of society. So the data that is collected and the data that is used to learn, it has these present in it. It's the latency is there, and that the outcome, the final outcome of the system represents these. So that is one view. The other view is that it's not just the data set, it's everyone from the coders to the people who commission those projects, and so it's distributed just like the system. It is distributed everywhere, and there's no simple solution to this. So what do you think about this? What are your views on the problem of bias, and which approach would offer a better solution, and what could it be?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say that, for those in the audience, I just put a link in the chat, which is a bunch of articles, general interest articles that I've written about these issues. I'm basically saying it in word, in orally, what I've written before. One of those articles is actually about AI and bias that, that would probably go into a lot more finer, nuanced discussion than I'll be able to do here. So I would just point that out. And so the biggest way, obviously, bias comes into example-based learning is that the data is being collected from the society we live in. And so it reflects the society. And the problem is that I tend to basically say the following thing, that it's a question of how you use the data. So if you were to consider, let's say, something, I mean, my wife is an engineer. She went to IIT Kharagpur, and she still tells me that in many cases, they would have to go across multiple buildings to find a women's restroom because they didn't really have that many women in engineering. And so they didn't really think that they needed like women's restrooms. Okay. So now if you're trying to learn from existing data about, for a meeting that you're going to hold today, how many men's restrooms and how many women's restrooms are required to support for all the people that might show up in an engineering college meeting or something, the data might actually be fine in essentially making that decision correctly. If on the other hand, you're using this data, today's data, to construct like actual whatever, like the paka restrooms, for which will be there for like tens and 20 like decades on, then you are cementing the current societal state into future. The problem is, the whole point is, all societies are imperfect and we are always trying to change. And so it's this use of data to make decisions. It depends on what decision is being made, because the data is very much reflective of the current society from which you have gleaned that data. Okay. Oftentimes that's partly, it's not that there was no, I mean, again, I'm pretty sure you guys realize this, that it's not that there is no bias in human decision making. Judges are biased. It's just they know how to cover their tracks. We're all smart. I basically may have very well, from the beginning of the time I looked at your face, might have decided, something about you. But I would be smart enough not to say it. And even if I were to say it, I would basically kind of cover my tracks by providing some nice sounding explanation, which is basically what we have done, for quite a long time. What the large scale data and learning from the large scale data could tell us is, it actually is a mirror to the society. This is actually what is happening in the society. Despite all the individual rationalizations that judges might give, saying we are completely ignoring the race, gender of the defendant. If on the large scale, you can show like a very high correlation between the race of the defendant and the guilty decisions on them, that are not consistent with actual level of crime committed by different sets of people, then you have essentially proved that irrespective of your protest to the contrary, as a society, we actually do have racism. We, as a society, we do have biased decision making. So you could actually say that in some sense, this is putting a big mirror to your society, to us. This is how we are. So in fact, there's this funny story, right? So Amazon tried to automate hiring because people were doing resumes, they're looking at the resumes and deciding whether somebody should be called for interview, should be offered job, etc. And what did they do? They essentially took the examples that they have in their own corporation about resumes, whether the person got a job or not, resumes, whether the person got a job or not. And they trained a system on this. And then, having trained the system, they could actually test the system. When I try to test you, the moment you realize that I'm trying to test you, the human being, you will be completely on your guard. You will start being extra nice, extra non-racist, extra gender equality person, because you know that you are in my in my lens. Okay, but when I'm gone, you will be going back to your normal way of life. A machine, once it's trained, it basically just doesn't realize that it's being looked at. So what did Amazon do? It tested its learned system and found that there was clear-cut gender disparity. It was basically saying no to all women, resumes, all the women candidates. Now, did the machine somehow decide to be anti-women? No, it just was following the clear-cut data that Amazon was. So Amazon's machine learning algorithm for hiring was, sexist because Amazon was sexist. The point was, individually, if we are sexist, if anybody asks us, we can come up with very quick rationalization saying, no, this case is different. But again, proof is in the pudding. I took your data. I essentially learned the pattern that seems to be explaining what you have done on all these past cases, and I apply it to the future cases. It's very clear to me that there is gender bias. You see what I'm saying? So it's sort of, in a way, it quantifies the bias that exists, and saying let's remove this just so that we don't have to look at it is not necessarily a good idea, because you can essentially continue to be biased and keep patting yourself on the back saying, I am different. I am not sexist. I am not racist. Somebody else is bad. But if all of us are, there's this old story that as a kid I used to be told that the king essentially wants to make payash, kheer, for his birthday, and he puts this huge big container outside and tells people, each of you are required to pour like whatever, one share of milk, but make sure that it's not diluted, because I'm going to be mad at you guys if it is, more than like 10% diluted. So in the evening, he goes and finds that he has 100% water, because everybody essentially assumed, I'm sure the other guys will pour pure milk because, they're not diluted. So I can just take a chance and pour more water, which is basically what could be happening when we are doing individualized decisions. And so this collective data analysis is something that's not necessarily bad. It is putting a mirror to you, the society. Now, how do you remove the bias? That too is actually quite a tricky situation. To some extent, to change the bias, remember I think there's this quote attributed to Gandhi that, be the change you want to see in the world. You have to be the change you want to see in the world. The reason this data exists about Amazon, hiring practices or any of these societal data is because society is doing it. We are biased. And so the way you can avoid that is the hard way. The right way to avoid it is that we essentially take this as a warning and realize that we should not be as biased, hopefully. But of course, that's going to take a longer time. The easier way is to change the data. Okay, but that is kind of nonsensical at some level, because I would say that if there is a social engineering to be done, I want the social engineering to be done on the society, not on the data by a bunch of engineers, because that gives you some sort of a false sense of security that, oh, we solved the problem of racism. Oh, we solved the problem of sexism because we took the data that actually is in the society and then just kind of balanced it. Suddenly, all of a sudden in India, we'll see that 50% women in engineering institutions because we just balance the data. But if you actually go to an engineering college, there won't be 50% women in engineering. And so it's a tricky situation as to how to deal with this. So I tend to think that, yes, you should be careful about applying decisions learned from collected data into for societal decisions. This is basically what that article that I linked there also talks about. But at the same time, I don't understand this pessimism that we should never collect data. This is sort of like saying we should never test for COVID because we might find that there is COVID in India. That makes no sense to me. You should test and deal with the consequences of what actually the data is saying, right? And if you don't, then in essence, you're blind and happy about being blind. And that's not necessarily a good thing too. And I don't think you can remove bias directly. Again, it's like by testing for COVID, you don't remove COVID. It gives you knowledge about how much COVID is there, and it changes your decisions as to how much maybe social distancing you need to use, how many Kumbh Melas you can hold, how much whatever the election meetings you can hold, etc., etc. And so the point is that you do want to collect the data and you want to see what the database decisions are saying, but you should also be using that you have to give care to where those decisions are being used. As I said, any societal data based on the current snapshot of the society should not be used for planning 10 years from now, especially because we expect society to change. Whereas this is not true, by the way, for physics. If you collected data about the universe and then you decided, for example, how much light is likely to be coming from different galaxies in a certain part of the sky, that's not going to change 10 years. That's not going to change in even millions of years. So that data can be used to make decisions both for now and for later in terms of how many telescopes you need to build, etc. But on the other hand, how many restrooms should there be in an engineering college? That's not a decision you can make based on the current data alone. And it's the same thing so I think it's a nuanced issue. My only worry about the pessimism that people tend to have is, let's just stop testing. Let's just stop actually collecting data and see what the data says, lest it tells us. I mean, data is doing biased decision making because we are making biased decisions and we got away fine until now. And then the only other thing I would say, which is important to understand, is in a weird way, there is variance in human biases, right? I mean, while we are all making biased decisions, we are not uniformly biased. There are certain things that we tend to, universally, we tend to have certain kinds of biases across the country, etc. But many things are different in different countries, and so also even within the country, some judges might have certain kinds of racist biases. Some judges might actually be more neutral. Some judges may actually be a lot more progressive. And in a way, sometimes these things kind of cancel out each other a little bit. The problem about a widely deployed legal decision-making system, for example, that has been learned only from today's data and it's widely deployed, is that it institutionalizes the practice. It's not that you could go to a different judge who might be better. It's like, this is the system everybody is using, and it will say the same exact thing in every place. Okay, so that is one reason why it is important to understand to what level the decisions made by this learned system are biased. But again, as I said, it's actually possible for us to do this with a machine. It's much harder to do it for a human. Do you know any human who would admit that they're sexist? Do you know any human who would admit that they're racist? And yet we have racism and yet we have sexism because we are smart enough not to admit for things that are unfashionable, at least not fashionable anymore now. Machines don't have that smart because that's just a narrow thing that it's just been, doing. And it's not, when you're testing it, it doesn't have this special, let's be on guard because Rav is testing me, whereas people do. Okay, and so we can actually quantify the level of bias and make sure that, whether or not it's being, whether, societally, whether we're okay with it or not. So I view it as a more constructive way than just say, oh my God, machines are biased, as if somehow things were good before machines. Machines were just reflecting what we are doing. It's like saying, oh my God, my mirror is bad. It shows my face to be somewhat less beautiful than I have come to believe. This is your face, and it's just showing it.
Interesting point there at the end about uh, collection of data. And Mandira, would you like to come in at this point?
Yeah, we can take questions from the chat. I thank you for that perspective, Dr. Rao. I think the AI acting upon data sets, I think according to what you said, basically the biases are implicit in the collective behavior, which is being captured by these data, and that's when AI acts upon these. So social engineering falls like a responsibility on society as well, and not just an expectation from the AI developers. Yes, okay.
No,
Thank
because I
you.
don't really, yeah, I'm very worried about this tendency for engineers and computer scientists to become arbiters of everything. This is like, whatever they say, inmates running the asylum. I don't, I can talk to you about law as an outsider, but certainly I have no idea, the real underpinnings of law. And, there should be people who are essentially taking those decisions as against a bunch of engineers saying, yeah, looks like New York Times is saying this is not going to be seen well. Let me just engineer the data such that this won't be there. And it has to be a wider, deliberate discussion across the society. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. Uh, I think we'll take Pranav's question. Uh, could you throw light on facial recognition technologies which rely on machine learning to determine violation of law, which feeds on the bias of the data set and make arbitrary decisions? How do we overcome the fear that such AI-based tech are being used to inframe criminals based on their looks or prevent assembly of people at protest sites?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And the big thing in general, part based on AI and part based on the connected societies we live in now, there are many advantages. I'm sitting in my office without actually doing travel to come to talk to you, and we are still having like a reasonable conversation. There are many things that are possible but there are also large number of bad applications. So it's this thing that's been said that all technology is dual use. It can be used for good and it can be used for bad. Intelligence to some extent is the ultimate technology. So it can be having ultimate good as well as ultimate bad uses. It's not surprising to some extent. So facial recognition is very useful in many ways, but it can be easily misused for large scale surveillance. And it's been done in some countries. For example, China has very widespread surveillance of its citizens. And I'm worried that some other places are going towards that direction too, without thinking that clearly. Normally, given that any technology can be misused, you have to ask yourself, should we just stop developing a technology like at all? Versus, should we keep an oversight on the application of the technology without putting restrictions on the development of the technology itself? And there is a spectrum of solutions. Some things, for example, like cloning, genetic cloning, we have decided, oh my God, it's so bad that we can't possibly say we will do oversight after the technology has been developed. And so, many societies have said, no, this cannot even be done. But things like facial recognition and many of the other approaches, many of the other the AI things, it's still possible that since they have advantages, so for example, in fact, facial recognition can be used to find missing people, can be used to find real criminals from large scale data. Like, in January 6th, when we had this bunch of crowds going into Capitol in US and ransacking the place. And because everybody has, cell phones and everybody is taking videos of everything and they're posting it on all social media. In the past, that would have been very painful to go through all of them. Now they're able to actually do very good job of very quickly going through this mass of video data and recognize faces. And the level at which they're recognizing faces are like pretty unsettling. In fact, there was a story a couple of weeks in New York Times, back in New York Times, where they talked about one of the guys that one of the criminals they were able to find was in this photograph of somebody else, and that guy is not the criminal. But just like me, in the back of me, you see, Ganesh, right? So if you take a picture of this, then the system can say, yeah, there is a Ganesh in this picture. Similarly, that guy had on his wall, there was like a school photograph in which there was the picture of this guy, this person of interest. And the system was able to actually pinpoint that. That's the level at which face recognition can be done. In this case, it was a great thing because they were able to find somebody who's actually a pretty, worrisome, dangerous person and get them off the streets. And if you are doing like widespread surveillance with it, then you have chosen to essentially let the misapplications of it go unfettered. So the answer to me is, what they said, like eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And eternal vigilance is also the price of living with the benefits of technology. Every technology has bad sides. And I would definitely argue that facial recognition is not all purely evil technology. It has many good uses. But the civil societies have to be very carefully in the mix in trying to decide how much of it is being applied, to what sorts of things. The same thing for the database decision making. There's nothing wrong in applying the database decision making to certain scenarios, like, as I was differentiating, for example, societal data to make decisions about the current day society versus make decisions about 10 years later society, because that would be essentially have evolved. Similarly, you have to control the use of the technology rather than control the development of technology, because it does have many positive uses. So that I think, and the other very interesting thing that people have to keep in mind in general about AI technologies is the barrier between nations has disappeared. You can, for example, as a single country, you can say, we are not going to allow face recognition companies in our country. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean that your people can still be recognized by some startup in some other country who just happens to have all the face data, because it's just a bunch of data and it can be exported across borders. And, again, let's talk about that elephant in the room. The best way to isolate yourself from any other country's problems is not to be allowing any travel between them, either cyber travel or physical travel. If we did that, Delhi would be in the throes of second COVID now. So the answer is, should we stop travel completely forever so that this kind of a thing will never happen? Or is it that we really just have to be on the lookout all the time, because travel does have all sorts of advantages? And similarly, cyber travel also has all sorts of advantages, such as we are right now, the data is passing between US and India when I'm talking and when you are talking back. And how much of it are you going to just completely remove so that the data won't cross boundaries? And since it can cross boundaries, this is another thing that you people in law have to start worrying a lot about, because it's almost going to become less important as to what the country's laws are saying, because If your neighbor doesn't, not even neighbor, there's no such thing as neighbor. Everybody on the earth is connected to everybody right now by internet. And so like somebody can basically, you can make, for example, certain kinds of hacking a crime in India. So people in India, if they are found to do that, they can be convicted. What if some kid sitting in some faraway country essentially just does that? You have very little control. So international law winds up being all the more important. And we haven't had a great track record in essentially doing any much of an international law, really. So it's a very interesting question. So this is where these sorts of things I am not, it's easy to say just ban X, but really, can you? I mean, you can ban nuclear weapons because you can essentially put an embargo on on export of uranium. Okay, how are you actually going to ban AI technology, given essentially that most of the technology is very democratic in the sense you can sit wherever you are and essentially download working code, from working machine learning models and code, etc., from everywhere. And kids are, I mean, people are putting together very interesting new applications because of this democratization. But on the other hand, it also means that it will fall in the wrong hands too. And so it sort of makes us think a lot more about this freedom versus safety aspects. And there is no, I mean, law has always thought about it, and it knows that there is no simple solution. There is no all freedom, there is no all safety. And we do have to make very careful decisions on that. And, I think that's where the face recognition part is going to be too.
Interesting points there. I think there can be a lot of disagreements with the use of facial recognition technologies, and various cities, including San Francisco and Boston and others in Europe, have banned the use of facial recognition technology. I think there are various levels, and also who decides what criminal behavior is and who wields such power, and if there are ways to apprehend criminals without surveilling everybody. These are questions that we have to look into, but there are a lot of questions in the chat, so I'll quickly read one out of it. Saloni Sharma asks, every application of AI has a severe ethical implication. How do you think one can level with this problem at the stage of R&D, industry, as well as a consumer?
Yeah, so I would just say every application, every application of anything has severe ethical problem. Okay, and it's not really just specifically AI. There is specific kinds of issues in terms of a very particular class of AI applications, which is collecting societal data and using it to make decisions. That does have basically the whole issue of bias. That does have specific new problems that AI brings to the table. Ethics is not just a worry for AI; it's a worry for every technology in general, right? My thing is that again, it's essentially you have to be vigilant. You have to essentially consider the right versus wrong uses of database decision making, and there should be people who are making that case by case decisions. The society should be making case by case decisions on where you can use this technology, where you cannot use this technology. As I said, using the societal data and machine learned system from that to pinpoint that there is racism, that's a great thing. I mean, you can't say don't collect data just lest it shows that we have problems. But on the other hand, if you are actually making decisions based on that, you should also at least be able to provide some sorts of confidence measures as to what is the likelihood that this decision is affected. How much is it affected by the bias in the data, and how much is it actually worsened? So in fact, one interesting problem, in fact, we have research showing this too, that sometimes the the sort of the specific techniques used in the learning from the data might worsen the existing biases. So let me give you an example. This is actually for work for my group. So we basically were trying to look at this data where my students basically collected pictures of professors in engineering colleges from the school web pages in very, very different, every place, all sorts of places you collected. And suppose you basically were to train a system based on these faces, and then you asked it to imagine an engineer. Do you understand what I'm saying? If you asked it to imagine an engineer, it's not surprising that it will imagine a male face as an engineer, because there are more male faces than female faces in the STEM field as it exists. Okay, so in addition to just, one of the other things is, in addition to just looking for patterns in the data, one of the things that we can also do is to learn the distribution of the data and then be able to sample from other parts of this distribution. So having seen many, many faces, you can dream of a new face. That's what actually happens when you have dreams. Like yesterday night, believe it or not, in the middle of the night, I woke up, I found your email saying, yeah, the Zoom link is this way, etc. So then I know this was going to happen. And the rest of the night, I had this very complicated dream. I've never seen you guys' faces, but I had a very complicated dream involving both of you and the problems we are having in making the Zoom work, etc., the usual nightmares. But I had a face that I associated for these people. It's basically, my brain was smart enough to think that where it would be Indian faces. And so I made up some Indian faces. I've never seen you, so I could imagine faces. Machines can imagine faces too. The interesting question is, if there were, let's say, 89% male and 11% female in the original data, what is the percentage of male versus female faces in the imagined data? If it is still 89% and 11%, you say you're only perpetuating biases. Okay? If it is more like 93% and 7%, that means you are exacerbating biases. And it turns out that for things due to specific technical failures of the system, such as, there is this idea called mode collapse that happens when these systems are trained to produce, to learn from the data to produce the new data points. They tend to wind up actually exacerbating the bias. That is a real worry. That is a technical problem that we in AI should be careful about. Do you understand what I'm saying? So we actually have a paper on this, basically showing that this mode collapse occurs, and that actually worsens the bias even more than it was bad enough that there were 89% male and 11% female. In the imagined faces, it turns out that even more are male and even less are female. And that can actually happen. And that is the kind of thing that you should be careful about. This was obviously inadvertent amplification of bias. Nobody wrote GAN systems to make this happen. It's just that majority classes tend to sometimes get, become bigger majority. In many, things have this property in general. And so those sorts of things you need to be, careful in making sure that that sort of additional exacerbation of bias doesn't exist. But otherwise, the actual data does have bias. And, coming back to our old discussion, if I want to make the world, if I want to somehow make the system not think that an engineering professor doesn't mean it is a male face, what exactly am I supposed to do? Do I change the data that I collected such that I basically, even though I collected 10 million pictures, let's say 9 million of them are male and 1 million are female, so I just throw away 8 million of the male faces, so that is 1 million male, 1 million female faces, and I train the system that way. In that sense, you have a sort of a false sense of, oh my God, my system is unbiased. But it's not for this world. It's for Mars. It's not for Earth. You see what I'm saying? And it actually makes all sorts of random wrong decisions. And it doesn't really solve any problems. What really happens And this is another very interesting thing, and this is actually kind of a technical point, which harks back to what we were discussing in the beginning. Originally, AI used to focus on explicit knowledge tasks, where we provide to the system the laws that we as a society agreed on about how to do things. Now we then focused on, but that sort of approaches don't work for many tacit knowledge tasks like face recognition, in language recognition, etc. Because we do them, we don't quite know how we do them. It turns out that all explicit knowledge can also be handled as tacit knowledge. So you can, learning from examples will work for everything. And so one strange thing that people have been doing is to actually take explicit knowledge, convert it into data points, just so that you can learn the pattern, which is sort of crazy because the human civilization has progressed to actually come up with explicit causal knowledge about how things work, etc., in the world that we are in. But technically, people are a lot more into let's just do everything based on examples, because that will work, But of course, in some sense, it has no guarantees that it will actually reflect the knowledge that we have essentially codified as a civilization. So one connection between that general craze about trying to do everything from examples, even when there is explicit knowledge and bias, and that problem and the bias problem is that it's not, I mean, with all due respect, I don't know anything about you, but I know generally that people are somewhat like me. And can I certify that I don't ever have even a fleeting racist, sexist thought in my head? Most people cannot. But do I say it? Do I explicitly let my behavior be guided by those racist and sexist thoughts? That's what I control. So there is two parts of our brain. I mean, in fact, there's this idea called system 1 and system 2. System 1 is this, doing tasks that can be done in a millisecond or a second. And this is, by the way, this is another interesting thing, that AI was a lot more into system 2 before, and it's a lot more into system 1 now, because system 1 tasks cannot actually be done by recipes oftentimes, because we may not actually have recipes, because they tend to be tacit knowledge tasks. The reason the civilization has always been about system 2. We have parts of our brain that we share with reptiles evolutionarily, but there is this other parts of the brain that was a lot more newer in an evolutionary sense, and they suppress some of these other impulses that the evolution has built into us, because it worked when we were reptiles, it worked when we were like animals. We had to run if we sense some danger. So my joke is, when you see a tiger, you run away from the tiger. Did you ever stop and wonder what might the tiger feel? What if the tiger was a nice tiger? It just wanted to say hello to you. And by running away, you are essentially insulting its good intentions. You translate, you kind of substitute for tiger some person with a different colored skin than you, and you run away from them. Do you have bias? And the reason we don't is not because our reptilian brain tells us don't have to run away from this. No, it still tells us. But we have this codified knowledge which then suppresses that. And so we are able to do things that are more civilized. Civilization is a learned behavior. That's why we say we are civilized, right? And AI systems don't have the civilization. To some extent is this learned knowledge that we share, and that should be added on top of examples. Do you see what I'm saying? That is one way. And then you can say whether or not these are the guidelines you are supposed to follow. It's not just enough to say that this is the most likely decision, but is this also handling these other guidelines? And combining tacit and explicit reasoning will help quite a bit in solving some of these issues.
So combining tacit and explicit reasoning, is that combining how old approaches to AI, like symbolic approaches, and the present approaches? Is
Again,
that
as I said, there is no old and new. It is more a chronological thing, but it's really more about the tacit knowledge task cannot really be handled by writing programs for them. They can only be learned. Explicit knowledge tasks can still be learned, but they can also be, the recipes for them can be given. Civilization has always been about explicit knowledge tasks. I mean, you guys in law know this, right? Because what are all those books behind all the judges, right? It's basically this knowledge that you have codified. And so it is actually possible to pass this on, this knowledge from place to place. Every generation learns how to swim separately. Not every generation learns how to do law separately. They basically read the books that the previous guys have written, right? So you need to combine these two aspects. And that's a bigger technical issue. So I just put another link on this, a CSEM article that talks about combining explicit and tacit knowledge. It's a little more technical from, from for a law audience, but it sort of might make sense based on what we just talked about. But really, that's the reality. You need to combine not just example-based learning. I mean, if you ever find yourself taking your hard-won causal knowledge and converting it into examples, you are on the wrong path. The whole civilization has been to find patterns, because one of the other things you all know, all of us know, is patterns give us correlational knowledge. Correlation is not causation. Civilization told us what is causation, and we killed ourselves to find out what causation is. For the longest time, every observation that we made was completely consistent with the Earth being the center of the universe. Forget about the planetary system. So we were quite happy with it. So you give it, the same observational data to a machine learning system. Do you think it will say, no, 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 sun is the center? No, of course not. It will still say Earth is at the center. And to learn causal knowledge from data is, by the way, another very big technical challenge, because one of the interesting things is not all observational data. It's not possible to actually learn causal models from observational data in general. To be able to learn causal knowledge, you need to do interventions. You need to actually, this is exactly why, for example, in drugs, in vaccines, you have trials. What is this RCT? What is this randomized controlled trial? Randomized controlled trial is trying to figure out, is that you're getting COVID less if you're vaccinated. Is that a causal connection, or is it a correlational connection? That's exactly what it's trying to do. And it turns out RCT is sort of a very inefficient way of establishing causality. So there's a lot of interesting work being done in AI right now, in trying to use the causal knowledge we have in some areas to actually make it part of the system. In other cases where we don't have causal knowledge, trying to figure out, how to actually establish causality more efficiently than these very inefficient methods such as RCT, the randomized control trials.
I have so many questions to ask about technical solutions to problems that we face right now, and the coming age of new AI systems and the research that is being done. But I guess I fear we are running out of time, and so I would like to cover the questions in the chat at least.
Okay.
Mandira, over to you.
Yes, I think your discussion also opens a lot related to AI and the collaboration with other disciplines to understand human values also. So a lot of like opportunities for psychologists and sociologists to work in collaboration with AI experts. I would want to take Priyanka's question, which I think you kind of answered, but then okay, so So that's a really wonderful way of explaining the bias in data. If the current data is a reflection of the existing societal bias, how should the training data be chosen?
I again, as I said, make sure that data collection doesn't introduce deliberate biases, which you know that the whole field of statistics is very much trying to tell you how to collect data such that it's not deliberately biased, deliberately or inadvertently biased. The collection can actually be biased. Like if you only, for example, ask a certain subset of people. Remember, there was this one time where, like, I think India Today would do this great survey of what the election outcome will be by a phone. This was when only the richest of the rich people in India had phones. So
Mhm.
clearly they got a cross section of the richest of the rich people, and they assumed it's the same cross section as all of India. That's just dumb. And that was dumb before AI, that is dumb after AI. Okay.
Right.
This has nothing to do with, so make sure that you don't do that. Having done that, the other thing at the same time, I would caution you again is changing the data collection that somehow that such that somehow it makes up for the societal imbalances, because there you are stepping into social engineering the data as again as social engineering the society. Do you understand what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
you want to know the ground reality of India, not the one that you want to believe in. So India Today was stupid in essentially just thinking that a phone-based survey would be representative of a general election in India. But you can also be wishy-washy by saying that I will just make sure that I will, essentially collect data in such a way that, for example, I ask 50% of the female engineering professors. I mean, 50% of the, if something about engineering thing, let's say, and you ask 50% of the female professors and 50% of the male professors, depending on what you're trying to use this data for, it could actually be sort of a social engineering, because 50% of the overall engineering professors are not female. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do I want the world to be that way? No, I don't. But do I want to close my eyes and hope that the world is already in the way I want it to be? That is silly. Do you see what I'm saying? So data collection should avoid inadvertently introducing biases. It should also stop itself from the temptation of somehow making the data collection solve the societal problems, even though society itself continues to have those problems. That just makes no sense, right? And so it is, again, it's a hard question. And I think you can avoid the completely wrong things, such as both these directions. And yet, after that, it's, then it is really the society. At that point, you can say, notice that part of civilization is to say that majority opinion is not necessarily what the society will do, right? I mean, it's like every country has its problem. Here we had in US, there was slavery at one point of time. In India, for a long time, there's untouchability. If you basically did a majority survey, you do realize that lots of people still have that sort of a mindset. So you don't want to change the data so that you believe that nobody has this mindset and everything has become 50, good. However, you can put a filter on the decisions that this model makes to make sure that it is consistent with our civilizational values. Don't change the data. Think about the outcomes. Don't change the data. Pick the data in the most reasonable way possible. Neither should you introduce inadvertent biases, nor should you be tempted to actually add all sorts of, your own activism into data collection, because activism should be done on the ground. Change the world, not the data. Okay.
There's another question from Saloni Sharma, and you can be brief since we know you're running out of time. The question is: social sciences and sciences seem to be at loggerheads when it comes to the use of AI. How do you view this conflict? And from your standpoint, where do you think a point of intersection really lies?
Um, I'm not really sure that they are at loggerheads. I'm not quite sure why somebody said they're at loggerheads. Maybe they can make it clearer as to why they think they are at loggerheads. I do think they should work more together. In fact, one of the interesting things is, again, as I said, you shouldn't depend on engineers to do law for you, right? I mean, basically, it should be an interdisciplinary. This is the reason I agreed to talk to you guys, right? I mean, and this is the reason I'm happy that you are talking to me, because it's extremely important that there is an interdisciplinary understanding. You know, we won't understand everything. I will never understand all the intricacies of law. Maybe you will understand all the intricacies of AI, but maybe not. But we do have to have a better sense than, oh my God, things are burning and there's no hope. I actually see a lot more reason for hope in terms of interdisciplinary um, connections nowadays than it used to be before. I think there should be more, but like when I was a president of III, we started this conference called AI Ethics and Society, and it's a completely interdisciplinary conference. We have like 4 sub-program committees on that. One for philosophy, one for law, one for AI, and one for economics. And then papers can actually cross all these areas and so on. And again, I think that is very much possible, and there's a lot of interest. That's the advantage. I mean, every cloud has a silver lining. I'm not particularly happy with all the hype. As much as I love AI, I don't necessarily think that the hype sometimes causes people to have wrong understanding of what the reality is than actually the right understanding, because everybody just sort of thinks that this is what. I mean, I make this joke that the number of the experts in AI without any background in AI has never been higher. Everybody is an expert in AI. Apparently, you are the only people who are not, because you are somehow thinking that you should talk to somebody about this. But everybody just decides that if you go to LinkedIn, responsible AI is one of the like a evergreen things to have along with as your classification, because you just can say you are a responsible AI person. Okay, so there's that negative hype, but on the other hand, the fact that people in law, people in philosophy, people in economics are interested in what's going on here and are willing to take part in collaborations is a very positive sign. There are good forums for actually having very thoughtful scholarly discussions about it. There's several AI and law conferences. You probably know VRobot conference that Yale does. At ASU, we have this what I think governance of emerging technologies, GET conference that my colleague runs. There's they're all very, in fact, by the way, GET is the conference where I was telling you before we started. That was the conference where I went to give my talk, and I found that nobody uses slide projectors because they are actually lawyers. And so they actually, this is like the first time for a long time, I talked without slides. But basically that sort of a thing. The fact that I went there is a good thing for me, because I learned to talk to people from across disciplines. And I think I see this as more of a positive thing of late than it used to be before. So I'm more optimistic.
Okay, a question from Dr. Nupur Chaudhary. Should there at least be a responsibility for a no harm for any entity deploying AI legally? A no harm principle.
Yeah, I mean, yes. But again, society enforces that. Do you understand what I'm saying? Basically, I agree that, I mean, I have a Twitter account, and there's a whole bunch of things I keep saying. One of which I most recently said is that you don't expect big AI companies to decide how to responsibly use their technology any more than you should have expected Philip Morris to decide how to responsibly sell cigarettes. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because there's a clear cut, clear cut conflict of interest. They may be well meaning, but eventually they're also interested in developing the technology. And the reality is that society, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom and the price of new technologies. So the society should have oversight on that. So to that question, should there be responsibility? Yes, but you should enforce that responsibility. You, me, everybody as part of the society should say, yeah, you are welcome to develop technologies, but you will be held liable for the decisions that these things are making. And that is very reasonable. But just don't assume that they will do the right thing, because if it's so much simpler to say sorry. I mean, what they say, right? It's infinitely easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission. Okay, it's so much easier for people to say after the fact, oh my God, we didn't know that people can use Facebook to manipulate elections or kill each other in Myanmar, etc. To some extent, maybe they also didn't know. I don't know. I mean, I was alive during and I was an adult during the developments of these technologies, and I don't think I realized that Facebook would have this sort of an impact. Okay. And then when they probably found out a little faster than us, they still have obviously quite a bit of economic incentives to continue using them, because controlling attention is how they make money. But I see the positive aspects that we woke up. We woke up much faster. Again, we can think of all the negative things about COVID, but to me, the greatest positive thing is never in the human civilization have we come up with vaccines within 1 year of a new virus striking. Do you understand what I'm saying? And similarly, never in our history have we been so vigilant as to hold the Facebooks and Googles of the world accountable. The lag used to be much higher. Remember how long it took for us to figure out that cigarettes are actually causing lung cancer and that we should be holding the companies responsible. It took forever. Compared to that, it's much faster now. And so I see it's positive. And, to some extent, there'll always be lag unless we are all Renaissance people. We do everything together with no conflict of interest. We are not that. You will be thinking about law a lot more. I would be thinking about the technology a lot more. Facebook will be thinking about its bottom line a lot more. That's just normal. And, and I always thought actually that law is that basically taking these trade-offs into account and making sure that we don't cross lines. And so society should enforce that. And that's a very reasonable thing. Just don't expect that by complaining, people will become nice. That just makes no sense. That's like a very rosy-eyed view of the world.
I guess we have run out of time,
Yes.
and I would just like to draw everybody's attention to the links that Professor Rao has pasted in the chat. You can follow his work over there. There's one paper and his writing for the Hill. I've also just sent his Twitter ID, and you can follow him over there. And Mandira, over to you.
Yeah, I think it was a really enriching discussion to actually kind of subverted a lot of assumptions we have coming from social science backgrounds, thinking that, of course, technology has an intention, but then that intention is kind of deployed at the ground level by hands that go in making into that technology. And of course, that has been my takeaway from this discussion. So I would just like to thank you again, Dr. Rao, for coming and discussing, and of course at this odd time for you, but we've been really enriched with your inputs on AI. Yes, and
Thank you. Thank you for your attention, and it was fun.
Thank you so much. We would love to host you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience.
Thank you, guys.
thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.